History shapes everything we do and everything we believe. Chokepoints Through Time, a journey through the pivotal moments of mankind's story. This is history as you've never heard it before. And now, here is Dr. Wayne Sedlak.
Well, I'd like to welcome you to yet another episode of Chokepoints Through Time. By way of an announcement before we start, just want to remind many of you, some of you are just hearing us for the first time, this September, another class will open up. We've had these classes for many years. We've had people on 2 continents attend them. They're popular and they're free. On September 8th, that's a Tuesday, beginning at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, extending to 2:30, and every Tuesday and Thursday from that point on, we'll be doing a special kind of biblical economics. Now, I say special because that class, when you hear economics, you hear what many call the dismal science. Economics, like any discipline, is dismal without the Lord. There is, in the Bible, a full-scale economics, both basic and advanced. This course is going to entail not just entrepreneurial skills and training in entrepreneurship, training in sound economic reasoning, economic discernment of the news, etc., economic stewardship, but also it's going to give you historical arms and legs, historical persons, places, events that we're going to use to put arms and legs on the precepts. In addition to that, though, we're going to be dealing with the science of money. That's the flank that the ungodly, in positions of principalities and authorities, spiritual wickedness in high places, that's the flank they have on America right now. The science of money. The money science is biblically developed. It is also easily perverted, as the Bible itself warns us. So our course is going to entail much. It's going to go for 2 semesters. It's going to be offered to those that want to use it for their homeschooling. Their credit, we welcome adults. We've actually had far more adults, many homeschoolers, but far more adults in the programs we've had in the past. Now you can go to visionviewpoint.com, do the drop-down menus, see the economics course it's offered, go there quickly. You can register for free. So it's all for you. If you want it, it's right there. And God bless you. Not sure that we're going to be putting it up, however, on the website. That's yet another decision that's going to have to be made by our presbytery. And there are reasons for that. It may be offered on a far broader scale than simply on the website, but that's a future decision we'll have to make. I want to begin today by going backward again in history. The July 4th, 1819 celebrations of Independence Day throughout the United States. You see, Independence Day celebration 1819 followed the War of 1812, just 3 years earlier had been completed. And we were in what was called the era of good feelings. But that era of good feelings was much more powerful than simply people having fun being an American. For the most part, Americans enjoyed being Americans. They were proud of their country because a new realization had taken place. The pulpits have been addressing this for over 100 years. By this, I mean that the Lord has a covenant with nations. And when those nations embrace the Lord Jesus as their covenantal God, I'm not saying that there is a state religion. I'm not talking about that. In fact, that's to the contrary of what I'm talking about. But when a nation is thoroughly Christianized, as we were, even our frontiers were being Christianized. you have Christianity as the bedrock faith. Now, we don't have that anymore. We have remnants of it. But in 1819, people were believing what the pulpits have been saying. When the Lord blesses a people who've embraced him, embraced his son, blessings flow from that. Was it that a passage that was often cited in sermons? It says in Deuteronomy, the Lord shall cause thine enemies that rise up against thee be smit before thy face. They shall come out against thee one way and flee before thee 7 ways. Now that was cited often in the pulpits. You can imagine why. I'm not entirely sure that we fully realize the scope of what Americans realized and the dangers they realized they had been under. Yes, it's true, the Lord shall cause thine enemies that rise up against thee to be smitten before thy face. That's what happened. And they'll come against you one way, they'll flee before you 7 ways. Well, in our case, it was more than 7. I realize that 7's being used symbolically, metaphorically, but it was more than 7. You see, America was encircled by many threats before the War of 1812. We had a hostile border with Canada, both Indians and British. British Canada, the British were still smarting from that first loss in the War for Independence. And they had moved troops up there, and troops are still there. So that border was relatively undefended. And now we're approaching a second war with Great Britain, which is why they didn't move the troops out of there. And they would bring more in, of course, during the War of 1812. So the border is undefined. In fact, it was undefined from Maine all the way across the Great Lakes, all the way to the Pacific. And Britain wanted that vast western territory west of the Mississippi. She also wanted a big chunk of territory to the north, just west of the Great Lakes, part of the Northwest Territory. And she looked jealously at the Ohio River Valley, just south of the Great Lakes, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. The French and their Spanish allies laid claim to what was called Louisiana. We bought Louisiana Purchase. Tom Jefferson did that. I believe he was right in doing it, even though the Constitution didn't allow him. You see, there was a threat to the actual existence of the United States. England wanted that territory. He can be criticized both ways, but the net effect is we got the territory, the purchase. And all of America agreed to it. So in essence, we amended the Constitution by common consent. Not exactly the way it should be done, but there's no time. He bought the purchase, and that thwarted British designs as the British were bribing the Indians out in the West, telling stories about our expansion out there. So the Indian presence in the west of the Mississippi, but there are also the Indian presence in the Northwest Territory, which was receding at that point because of the First War of Independence, and subsequent battles with the Indians up in the Michigan Territory. They were starting to be beaten back. But that was a trigger point. Spanish control of the lower Mississippi, choking the New Orleans area. The Spanish placed heavy tolls and taxes on traffic coming down the Mississippi. A lot of farmers depended upon getting the market from the interior of the United States coming down the Mississippi. Americans. That could be choked off at any time. Spain controlled Florida. The British were a threat from the Bahamas, an easy reach for their navy, right to our coasts, and the blockade that would, in fact, be attempted. Trade markets, well, just like it was in accessing down through New Orleans, then out the Gulf of Mexico, trade markets in Europe were being cut off. We didn't have many allies in Europe. We didn't have a full-fledged navy. And yet, out of it all, because we were still a devout Christian people, the Lord shall cause thine enemies to rise up against thee, to be smitten before thee. And the pulpits thundered that passage, and many like it. They shall come out against thee one way, and flee before thee 7 ways. Well, they did. All of those threats I just announced, vaporized. And even the most crass unbeliever in America had to admit that the Christian faith had been right. It had also provided the strength of character to take the fight to all of these at once. And we prevailed, just like David did in Israel when he was surrounded by enemies. The Philistines there in the west, to the north, the Syrians. To the east, you got the Moabites, you got the Ammonites, you got the Edomites. Egypt still looks and lusts after Palestine. To the southwest, to the north, there's Phoenician states. And throughout Israel, there was banditry in areas where stability was lacking. David fought all of those in the name of the Lord and prevailed. You see the expression, his adoration, his adulation of, and here's something that we have to get a hold of here in our churches: the law of the Lord. Now, what if I were to have begun this podcast and I had said to you as a Christian, there's an area of the Bible that is, it's not really accurate. It's not even holy. It's really judgmental. It's because that's what people say about the law of the Lord, the Pentateuch. Now, I don't say that. I'm really rehearsing what is commonly taught. Many Christians take the position that the law is just for an old dispensation. So what if I'd have started this podcast, you not knowing where I was going? I said, there's whole portions of the Bible that are great to read, but they are worthless for our lives today. Oh, they have good stories in them, but by and large, they're not appropriate for a Christian today. You'd have been shocked, I'm sure. You should have been at least uneasy. Wait a minute, I'm not sure I like what I'm hearing. You should not like it at all. You see, the Apostle Paul in Romans 7, one of the most, shall we say, underpublished, unannounced, unpreached upon chapters in the Bible, Romans 7, the Apostle Paul lists the functions of the law of the Lord. Obviously, we're not saved by the law. So let's get that one off our table here. Let's take that off the plate. Let's say it once and for all, you're not saved by the law. Though a fellow by the name of Schofield said that in the Old Testament, they were saved by the law. I have the text from his Schofield notes. Says that. Now, you can't have it both ways, as I said in a previous episode. You can't make the Old Testament kind of a primitive economy and turn around and say they're keeping the law of God, their salvation, because the Apostle Paul says it's impossible for anybody to keep the law. Anybody to be saved. If you sin in one point of the law, you have broken the integrity of the whole. This is the way one passage can be interpreted. It should be. Well, you see, I bring that up because the law of the Lord was published in the Church of America. I know that's not a popular thought again, but there is a passage in Proverbs that says, without vision the people perish, but happy is he who keeps the law. In Hebrew, remember, this is, as a linguist, this is a big deal to me, the structure of a passage as well as its content. And this passage has both those parts to it. And Solomon put them together for a reason. Without vision, people perish. In America at that time, we had vision. In fact, the vision grew And many trekked across into the plains. As you heard me say, it was not Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp and others like them that won the West. They helped. It was the church that won the West. As strange as that sounds, it was the church that won the War of 1812. It was the church that won the War for Independence. Not because our pulpits ran out onto the battlefield and started shooting muskets at the British, but because there's a necessary ingredient that goes into a soldier and more broadly to a people, and that's vision. Our people had it. The law of the Lord is designed to penetrate the soul. Paul says the law is a schoolmaster to lead us to Christ, and the pulpits were aflame with the law of the Lord. De Tocqueville described it as pulpits aflame with righteousness. Isn't it interesting that Paul talks about the law, Romans 7, and immediately he's talking about righteousness, chapter 8. Bad division break, by the way, chapter break there, which is not inspired. The text is inspired, but the chapter and, verses generally are pretty good, but they're not necessarily inspired. From the law, read it for yourself. Paul says, with my mind, I'm enslaved to the law of God. That's probably why some people might say that they don't like the Apostle Paul. So now we have another unholy area of the Bible, according to some. Oh, and then there's Genesis. And there are those that say, well, that's not accurate scientifically. Evolution is truer. So there's yet another area of the Bible that's unholy, inaccurate. I'll call it what it would be if that were true, a lie. Jesus said that to the rich young ruler. He said, why do you call me good? You're going to do what I say. So we have evolution taking out Genesis. We have plenty of historians that don't believe the Exodus took place. There was no Exodus. Oh, no. The Hebrews went out over a sea of reeds, which is like marshland. Not over the Red Sea, which, by the way, in 1996, I know the man, now deceased, who financed the marine expedition that found coralized remains of the Egyptian army's chariots, skeletons, smashed skeletons of horses and men, all Egyptian. Swords, spears, javelins, chariots, all crushed. Wonder why they're crushed. Could have been that millions of tons of water suddenly found them and crushed them, as the Bible says. But you see, until 1996, especially, many historians said, well, the Exodus, that's just not, that's not true. Yeah, it is true. So you see, there's another area of the Bible that many for decades believe wasn't true. You can't depend upon it. See what the devil's doing? He is parsing out the scriptures, cutting them up, shredding them. He's leaving you with, forgive me, a little Jesus, a verse or two here or there. But he's got many congregations believing the Bible is chock full of scientific holes, bad for your psychology, terrible history, and just plain wrong. And then there's that Moses and the law of God in the Pentateuch. Oh, no. You can't redact the history. You can't go back and say that our forefathers, who built a great nation, the majority of whom probably were not Christian in actual heart, but de Tocqueville points out that Americans were all claiming, almost all of them were claiming that Christianity, with a few exceptions, almost all were claiming that Christianity was necessary. And in fact, he said, as he went through the archives and documents of the era, that you have two classes of people. You've got those that really are Christian, really are convicted, and then there are those who don't want to look like they're not Christians. Therefore, he concludes, He didn't conclude we had a lot of hypocrites. He concluded, therefore, Christianity reigns supreme and rules by universal consent. In other words, everywhere, Christianity was the standard for morality, for thinking, for science, for education, for the home, family life. Churches have been saying that for over 100 years. And in 1819, the people were now realizing, guess what? That's true. The strength of America was in the spring of courage created by the love of the Lord and our neighbor. Courage, love. By the way, I'm citing, in my own way, the theme of a number of sermons of the era. Courage, love. Yes, Jesus pulled those two together. Greater love is no man than this, and man lay down his life for his friends. Americans had learned that loving your neighbor, loving your God were related. They didn't always do it. A generation later, they're going to go to war when that's violated because they never did settle. Actually, they were never allowed to settle the slavery problem. And I say that because a place called the Tontine Cafe, a place where Alexander Hamilton, Archibald Cox, Ben Marshall, and a host of other financiers, business millionaires we call them today, were making a lot of money on slavery. And with alarm, they saw the Presbyterian Church affecting the legislature of New York in 1799 to free the slaves throughout New York as a precedent for the rest of the country, and they went to war with it, this money power. They and the Presbyterians battling. The money power won by joining the abolitionists and usurping them, co-opting them. That's another story. That's why I don't think highly at all of Alexander Hamilton. I know what he was. He's a brilliant financier, trained in Europe, and way ahead of us. The average person, way ahead of George Washington, Patrick, and the rest of them, in the money science, which is exactly what we're going to study, the kind of thing that will come up in September and following. Alexander Hamilton cost us, as a people, a true abolitionism out of the churches. He helped wreck that movement, to the shame of our country. So don't blame that one on the churches. But America was filled with the joy the rejoicing, that indeed their pulpits have been right. And you see, there's a phrase called manifest destiny. Historians have denuded it of its Christian content, as they denude everything else in history, too often, of Christian content. Manifest destiny went too far in my understanding, but its origin was in the pulpits. It was the American expression of vision. Katzon in the Hebrew. Vision. Americans were speaking of vision. The pulpits were speaking of vision. Manifest destiny gave arms and legs to the idea that this was our continent. Like I said, we went too far with it. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, I think was fine. To claim that all of North America, Mexico, Central America, and all of Canada was ours alarmed those other authorities. And I think it should have. That was their country. But from sea to shining sea was ours. But there was more. It was the substantive effect of the Christian faith in the hearts of people. And non-believers saw it. Ethan Allen, for example, to call him a non-believer is really, to put it mildly. Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys were wild, often drunk, and cared little for Christianity. And yet, Ethan Allen, when he took Fort Ticonderoga and the British general demanded of him, by what authority do you do this? He said, in the name of the great Continental Congress and the great Jehovah. Now, wait a minute. A non-Christian who's wild cites two authorities, the Continental Congress, which was during the War for Independence, and the great Jehovah, the Lord. You'll find all throughout our early history non-believers quoting Jesus Christ. De Tocqueville says that. He says, I traveled even into the wilderness of America, and I found, in a lonely cabin, I found a Frenchman. I knew his reputation. You see, he was from my country. De Tocqueville was from France, visiting America, traveling extensively, and he finds this man. He says, I knew he was. He had a reputation in France. He was a revolutionary, an atheistic revolutionary. I stopped in at his cabin. We got a chance to talk. He said, I was shocked when I heard him cite Jesus Christ as an authority in a number of different issues in our conversation. Tocqueville said that the real ruling power in America was not Washington, D.C., was not found in the courts, was not found in the state capitals. The real power, the real government of the United States, he says, I found that government when I went into the churches of America and I heard pulpits aflame with righteousness. He also mentioned that where he could find the synagogues, they too were affected by this righteousness. See, there's a carryover effect. I mentioned that there's a common grace that theologians often refer to. I mentioned in my last episode, I believe it was, Johnny Appleseed. You know, Johnny Appleseed had that same, he was not a believer, made that point, but he was affected deeply by Christian aspiration and Christian view of the future, vision. He said so. That's why he planted orchards all throughout Northwest Territory. Thousands of acres of them. He caught the vision. Jesus says that we will have that effect on the common man. De Tocqueville wrote of this impact, I said substantive impact. You see, when people are gripped by biblical vision, I don't mean they have a dream. I mean they see. Like Jesus said, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. Abraham didn't see a vision in the sky. Abraham came to understand in heart the grandeur, the scope, the reach of what he was reading in those statutes, commandments, and laws that God gave him. Genesis 26 says he had the laws of God. So as he read those passages, like Proverbs 29:18 says, without vision he'd have perished, as a people would perish. But happy is he who keeps the law. He had vision. He could see the grandeur and the scope of what Christ was going to do. And so a common man, Abraham, became a great man. A common man, Johnny Appleseed, wasn't even a Christian, was so imbued with the sense of the grandeur of the vision of America. A common man became great. I go throughout all of our history as a people. In fact, we have a whole history of the women of the frontier. In fact, we have several of those editions already in print. If you'd like one, just go to Vision Viewpoint, get the email, and send us a request. It's a very minimal cost. But the women in America, there was a glory to them. Yes, there were some that were not so good, but I want to share with you, as I have in the past, before we start concluding that you're just selecting out some of the great ones, what about the ones that were, shall we say, prostitutes, ones that were drunkards too and had problems? Stop. The latter were in the minimum. E.G. Wakefield, in his famous economic treatise. You see, England was looking at this young America, and she was jealous of us. He wrote of that in the 1830s. He's an English economist and diplomat. His comparison of America, its rise economically, and England, its prosperity, comparing the two, is now an famous economic treatise concerning the women. E.G. Wakefield said, because of what corruption has done in English politics, laws have been written so that single women in England have a hard time getting honorable jobs. So too often they resort to prostitution. Therefore, you can find 100 prostitutes. If you travel 1 mile, you'll find 100 prostitutes in England. But go to America, where the laws are free. You travel 100 miles, and you might find 1 prostitute. Despite what Hollywood has shown you, the brothels of the western towns, Hollywood has redacted our history. That we're going to do at a future time. How Hollywood has rewritten American history and other histories as well. We'll do that another time. As for the substantive nature of the Christian impact upon people, de Tocqueville again wrote concerning the War for Independence. We beat Great Britain, and then there was a time of instability. The Constitution we had in place that we now have in place was not yet written. There was the Articles of Confederation. That was the Constitution at the time, and it wasn't working. So he said, we sat where many nations sit. Come out of a terrible war, a civil war, bloodshed, that kind of thinking is always possible. But it didn't happen in America, he wrote. But that which is new in the history of societies is to see a great people warned by its lawgivers that the wheels of government are stopping. That was the Articles of Confederation. Turn its attention on itself without haste or fear, sound the depth of the ill, and then wait for 2 years to find the remedy at leisure. And then, finally, when the remedy, that's the Constitution, has been indicated, they signed it, they ratified it, submitted voluntarily without it costing humanity a single tear or drop of blood. Lex de Tocqueville, Mayor Edition, pages 112 and 113. Imagine a nation comes out of a major war. Its government doesn't work. Lawgivers announce it. It ain't working. And then people don't panic. They don't start shooting at each other. There's no civil war. There's a little strife here and there. But the consequences were always local. Never can you say that the peace of the United States was at stake in those years. People then sat back. They sent delegates to a constitutional convention. It took them several months to come up with one. It went out to the states. They spent, a couple of years ratifying it. The last state ratified it in 1791. The process began in 1787. Then they put together a new government. And it all worked. Because that wasn't the government of the United States. The churches were. Washington said it. Patrick Henry said it. Ethan Allen even acknowledged it. The name of the great Jehovah. The pulpits kept the hearts of the people. but the pulpits taught the law of the Lord, which is why I believe there's no vision in the churches today. Here and there, there's some. There are great individuals in the church, don't get me wrong. But vision for the church and the kind of counsels that a nation once asked the church to provide are not available. In fact, that's exactly what Ezekiel says when the Lord tells him that the law at the hand of the Levite, or the priests, the Levites, has disappeared. And the councils, the great councils of the elders, the ancients, has also disappeared. There's no good counsel. And there's violence in the land. And they cry, peace, peace, when there is no peace. Well, America was the opposite of that. Because our people had vision, and they saw that the real government of God ruled the hearts of a people, not by passing laws, but by ruling the hearts of a people who then sent the right lawmakers to Congress to write the right kinds of laws, to elect and put in place the right kind of judges, Deuteronomy 1, to elect the right kinds of presidents, George Washington, John Adams, Tom Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. That's vision. Something we got to talk about some more. Remember, it's really about vision in September when it comes to economics. What can a people do with the stewardship that God gives to them?
This has been Chokepoints Through Time with Dr. Wayne Sedlak. Visit us at visionviewpoint.com, where you'll find a host of articles, books, and videos designed to answer any questions you may have. Join us Tuesdays and Fridays for Chokepoints Through Time with Dr. Wayne Sedlak.